Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. And thank you to DMI for inviting us to be here with you. I'm Summer Rector, and I am the VP of HR Consulting at QTI. And it's my pleasure to be here on behalf of QTI to share with you employment cost containment methods. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with QTI, we are focused on helping organizations to reach their full potential through people. And we do this through a variety of HR service offerings, including staffing, recruiting, HR outsourcing, and HR consulting. And we've leveraged the expertise of all of those areas to bring you the strategies we'll be discussing today. Now, to briefly frame our agenda, we'll begin with a brief overview of the current state we find ourselves in. We'll then briefly discuss effective workforce change strategy. Now, this is important because action without strategy is aimless. From there, we'll move into the bulk of our discussion today, which is focused on cost containment methods, employment cost containment in particular, but I'd be remiss if I didn't also share with you some perspective on non-employment cost containment. We'll wrap up with closing comments, links to additional resources for your benefit, and then we'll open the floor to questions. If you have questions as we're going through this webinar today, I welcome you to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in a question, and we'll then try to address that question at the end of our webinar. Well, to say that coronavirus has rapidly evolved the world around us, rapidly transformed the world around us, would be a gross understatement. It was only March 1st that we had 30 cases here in the US. It was only March 11th that the World Health Organization declared coronavirus to be a pandemic. And it was only March 25th that Governor Evers issued the Safer at Home order or enacted it here in the state of Wisconsin. Clearly, there's been a lot of change that's transformed in a rapid period of time, and it's caused us to need to face many challenges in such a short period of time. As we think about the impact that coronavirus has had in the state of Wisconsin specifically, we look at data here from Unicast that's tracking cell phone distance covered or GPS signals. And we've seen that there's been a 40 to 55% reduction in average distance traveled. Additionally, there's been a 60 to 65% reduction in non-essential visits. And these gradings here are in comparison to other states in our country. Now, from a non-essential visit standpoint, if you're unfamiliar with that, that would be things like non-essential healthcare appointments or non-essential retail stores, things along those lines. So as you assess the magnitude of this data, think about that impact on our economy. It's no wonder that many employers right now are struggling with a need to contain costs. It's a natural response to try to keep our organizations afloat during this difficult time. What's important to consider, however, is that leaders who manage the economic effects of this crisis in a clear and compassionate way, they're going to create more value for their companies and come out of this pandemic stronger than ever before. So with that said, I'd love to take you briefly through an effective workforce change strategy. As I mentioned earlier, it's crucial that we have a strategy in place to guide our actions. So as we think about an effective workforce change strategy, it's comprised of three components: philosophy, scenarios, and methods. And I'll briefly take you through each one of these items. To start, philosophy, it serves as a compass for leaders. It helps them, it builds on company values, spells out the commitments and the priorities and the guidelines that the organization is going to follow as it implements workforce changes. So it helps leaders answer questions such as, what value do we believe employees contribute to our business and its success? So when you think of that word value, think about things like funds raised, revenue, customer satisfaction or net promoter score, those ways that employees contribute to value of your business and its success. Next, think about what expectations do we have for employees' engagement, loyalty, flexibility, and ability to adapt and grow. So for example, are you the kind of organization who hires for the job, or are you hiring for potential? The third question to consider is, what do we owe employees as a fair exchange for what they have given us? Now, just this word owe and your natural reaction might indicate where your organization falls on this continuum. So some employers may be on one end of the spectrum where they believe they only owe employees, fair wages and benefits. And then there might be other employers on the opposite end of the spectrum who believe that they owe employees a great deal for their hard work and years of service. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just acknowledging where you fall on that spectrum and then using that philosophy to guide your decisions. Lastly, how can employees help us develop and implement workforce change? Crowdsourcing ideas from employees can yield fruitful solutions for employers, especially as they seek to contain costs for their organizations. That said, not all employers are comfortable engaging employees in these ideas. So it's important to think about what your organization's stance is and how employees can help you in that process. Now, because this term philosophy can be a bit ambiguous, we thought it'd be helpful if we shared an example with you. And this is one from Nokia back in 2011 when they were going through some financial hardship. And just to hit on the high points of their philosophy, they indicated that they were going to accept their responsibility as the driver of local economies and aim for the highest of aspirations in supporting employees. They also committed to taking an activist role in leading the program in the key areas that matter most. They also stated that they will involve all the relevant parties in the program design and operations. And lastly, they committed to communicating openly towards all stakeholders, even when they did not know the full answers. The second component to an effective workforce change strategy are scenarios, and we encourage you to model at least 3 scenarios for your organization. First, start with a healthy state. What does the good look like? Next, consider short-term economic volatility, the bad. Perhaps this is something that your organization is already experiencing right now. And third, model an uncertain future. We call this the ugly. Certainly, you're welcome to model more scenarios than this, but you want to keep it to a manageable number so that you're not lost in, trying to keep up with these models. Now, as you're doing this model, we encourage you to think about KPIs or key performance indicators for the success of your organization, such as sales, net income, free cash flow, as well as employee engagement, things along those lines. You want to make sure that you're tracking how your organization can sustain operations within each of these scenarios, including from a financial sustainability standpoint. The third component and final component is the methods. So to determine the appropriate methods for your workforce change strategy, we invite you to answer these 3 questions. First, how will we plan for workforce change on an ongoing basis? So as you're thinking about your plan, think about the products or services that you offer, the territories that you cover, your organizational structure. How are you going to plan? Next, think about who will be accountable for managing that. Will it be a cross-functional committee from the organization? Will Will it just be executives? Will it be operations managers? Who's going to be accountable within your organization? And lastly, what metrics will you be using to determine effectiveness? So again, think back to those KPIs of success for your organization, such as free cash flow, employee engagement levels, productivity, things along those lines, so that you are adapting your methods on an ongoing basis as needed to adapt to the scenarios that you're experiencing. Now let's transition into the bulk of our discussion today, which is focused on employment cost containment methods. Now, we start with employment cost containment because we know that on average across industries, the cost of people, or the talent of an organization, it tends to be about 70% of operating expenses. And as such, for most employers, this is the single largest expense. So it's natural that this is one of the first items to review when an employer is trying to contain costs. We'll go through each of these methods in order of high to low cost savings potential. To start, let's discuss layoffs, which can yield high cost savings potential. So layoffs are temporarily or permanently ceasing employment of select employees, and they may also include a hiring freeze. Now we're going to get into more of this on the next slide, but we encourage you to consider all other alternatives and methods first before resorting to layoffs, because while they can yield some high cost savings in the short term, there are some long-term consequences to be mindful of. Of course, if you have to resort to layoffs or frankly any of these methods today, it's important to think about objective criteria that you can use to inform the decisions of who is impacted. So for example, if you have to lay off a portion of your workforce, can you do that based on skills, seniority, performance rating, some objective criteria that's going to help mitigate your risk of an employment-related lawsuit or discrimination case, if you will. Of course, for all these reasons, we strongly encourage you to seek legal counsel before resorting to some of these methods. For layoffs, as an example, there's additional complexities to be mindful of, such as what's called the WARN Act, W-A-R-N, which there's state and federal versions, but here in the state of Wisconsin, as an example, employers with at least 50 or more employees are required to give at least 60 days notice of a mass layoff. Now there's exceptions for unforeseen circumstances, which many may argue coronavirus qualifies for, but there are no guarantees. It's not black and white. And so you want to make sure that you're engaging that legal counsel to support you in making this type of determination. Now, if you have to resort to a layoff, we encourage you to connect impacted employees with job boards, Department of Workforce Development resources such as the WorkShare program, which is an alternative to a layoff. And we've got a link to that program within our resources page of this webinar so that you've got that information following today, and you can look into that further if you'd like to do so. If you're able, we also encourage you to provide severance, such as 1 to 2 weeks of pay per year of service. Typically, there's some minimums and maximums to that. We might see about a 2-week minimum on the low end to a 16-week maximum, sometimes higher for executive level positions at the high end. As well as outplacement services. And if you're unfamiliar with these, there are services that include things like resume coaching, interview skill building, career workshops, things along those lines, which are going to help employees to connect with new employment opportunities more quickly and better manage your unemployment rate. So just for some market perspective on the prevalence of layoffs during this time, QTI recently did a survey of, it was about 256, primarily Wisconsin-based employers. We surveyed them on the impact of COVID-19 on talent and total reward strategies. And in that survey, we found that 12% of employers have had to resort to layoffs, with the median percentage of workforce laid off of about 8%. So not the majority of organizations at this time that have had to resort to layoffs, but still, we are seeing some that need to do or make this choice. Now, while layoffs can provide some significant cost savings, and we have seen the prevalence of layoffs increase over the past few decades, there are some long-term consequences to be mindful of. So for example, Harvard Business Review is just one of the many respected organizations that's done extensive research in this regard. And they found that survivors of a layoff experience a 20% decline in job performance. They also experience declines in organization commitment, job satisfaction, and many other things that we know are damaging to that productive, engaged employee, benefiting the employer. We've also seen that companies that experience layoffs are 2 times as likely to file for bankruptcy, and also downsizing a workforce by 1% leads to a 31% increase in voluntary turnover the next year. So we know there's a lot of costs then associated with that turnover in terms of lost productivity, cost to replace, cost to retain. So for all these reasons, as we prepare for recovery, we want to make sure that we're balancing that short-term survival need with that long-term success of the organization. The next method to consider is furlough or hours reduction. So this is temporarily reducing the hours, days, or weeks that employees can work, and as such, it can yield some high cost savings. This may be voluntary or mandated, and employees during this time may be able to collect some unemployment. So with thanks to some of the federal stimulus bills that have come through, we know that employees here in the state of Wisconsin who are unemployed or underemployed, they might be eligible for a maximum of about $950 per week in unemployment benefits. So something to consider connecting employees to if there is that need. You want to talk also with your health insurance carrier about benefits eligibility if this is a method you need to employ. Typically, carriers have a minimum FTE or a minimum number of hours that employees need to be working each week in order to qualify for benefits. But right now, due to circumstances, some of these carriers are waiving that benefit or that minimum, enabling employees to continue receiving the benefits coverage. So definitely something to talk with your carrier about. You also want to make sure you've got enough coverage for essential business operations. You want to keep those cash flows coming in the door as much as possible. Now, for some market perspective, in our survey of employers, we found that 33% of respondents have had to resort to furloughs, with the median percentage of workforce impacted being at 27%. So this is a more common method than layoffs that's being elected right now. The next method to consider is base pay reduction, which can yield some high to moderate cost savings. So this is reducing all or select employees' base pay levels, typically by a percentage. Now, in our COVID-19 survey, we found that about 17% of employers have elected this method, and the median percentage of reduction is about 15%, and it tends to be a consistent percentage across employee levels. We see that range typically being between 10 and 20% of base pay reduction, but again, median at that 15% level. Now, while most employers are doing a consistent reduction across employee levels, there are some that are doing decelerating pay decreases. In other words, they might perhaps have a 20% pay reduction for executives of the organization, and then a 10% pay reduction for non-executives, and it's going to help to protect the more vulnerable, lower wage workers of the organization. So that might also be something to consider. In all of this, you want to make sure that you're ensuring employees are paid according to local, state, and federal wage and hour laws, including minimum wage, as well as FLSA, or Fair Labor Standards Act, which has salary threshold and other tests for exemption, which essentially means that those who are exempt from overtime or not eligible for overtime, they need to be paid at least $684 a week. So if you're reducing someone who's exempt, you're reducing their salary and it's going to be below that $684 per week level, then you're going to want to make sure you're paying them for overtime that's accrued after that reduction. Of course, any change to base pay could impact incentive compensation. Say it's a calculation as a percentage of base pay, for example. Could impact benefits as well, such as 401k contributions. It might also impact internal equity, when you think about the pay of employees compared to each other within the organization, as well as market competitiveness. But if you need to prioritize that short-term survival, these might be things that you're going to have to compromise on in order to get through. The next method to consider is voluntary unpaid time off, which can yield moderate cost savings. So this is where you're encouraging employees to voluntarily take some unpaid time off. They might be doing it a day here or there, and obviously communicating in advance to not disrupt operations, but they might also choose to take that in one large stretch, or you could direct them to take it in one large stretch. And if you do choose to go down that path, so say they're taking 2 weeks or 3 weeks of unpaid leave in one chunk of time, you might consider labeling it as a sabbatical. It's just a more euphemistic way to think about it. And of course, for some employees, it might be welcome time as well. Certainly, this has been a very disruptive time in professional as well as personal lives of employees, especially if they have family obligations, such as young children at home who are not in school. So having this time away from work while their job is still protected may be welcomed by them. We encourage you to consider the impact on benefits eligibility, as mentioned earlier, as well as deductions. So say, for example, an employee is not being paid for a month. Will you be holding benefit deductions until they return, or how will that be paid for during that time? And of course, ensure coverage for essential business operations. So you might want to allow signups or encourage some people to change their dates in order to make sure you've got that appropriate coverage. The next method to consider is freezing or reducing incentive compensation. So this is temporarily stopping or reducing incentive plan payments, thinking about annual bonus or quarterly bonus or something along those lines, sales incentives. So depending on the number of employees that you have on these types of programs and how lucrative these programs are, it could yield some moderate cost savings. Some organizations are also evaluating goals at this time. Maybe it's changing a goal from a focus on revenue to a goal focused on net promoter score, or something that's more controllable for employees during this time. Also, you want to review your plan documents, employment agreements, offer letters, basically any commitments that you have made to payouts around these plans. Additionally, any constraints in which you need to operate. This is a great example for why it's important to have incentive plan documentation if you don't already, as it provides really good guidance in how to respond in these types of situations, which allows for consistency and plan administration long term. We also want you to remember, employees may be financially dependent on these incentives. So say, for example, you have a sales representative in your role who the majority of their compensation is made up in sales incentive compensation. Now might be a time where they need to be doing draws or bridges or something along those lines to help them get through this difficult time. And as such, you might choose to exclude select plans. So perhaps the freeze or reduction applies to the annual incentive plan, but not the sales incentive plan, as an example. The next method to consider is suspending the employer 401k match. So temporarily suspending or reducing that match, which depending on how many employees are enrolled and electing that match, it can yield some moderate to low savings for the organization. Of course, you want to make sure that your 401k plan allows you to make this change. And so consultation with your third-party administrator is going to be helpful, as well as perhaps your benefits broker in making that determination. You want to consider the impact on HCE, or highly compensated employee testing requirements. So it's just a good idea to include your 401k trustee to advise and help file the appropriate amendment if this is a path you choose to go down. The next method to consider is suspending cafeteria benefit contributions, which can yield moderate to low cost savings. So this is temporarily stopping any contributions that you have to cafeteria plans, if any. So another good reason to consult with your benefits broker or advisor. If your contribution is not reported on your Form 1095-C, then it's going to be easier for you to adjust. If it is reported, then you want to make sure that any reduction in contributions is not going to result in adjusted employee premiums exceeding 9.78% of employees' household income. And this applies to employers with 50 or more FTEs. The next method to consider is voluntary separation programs, which is, offering employees to take a separation from employment package. And typically it's putting together a compelling package such that there are employees that elect that package. So depending on how many employees elect that package, it can yield some low to moderate cost savings potential. Severance pay is commonly provided as part of this package in addition to outplacement services. We discussed both of those programs earlier. COBRA benefit support is also commonly offered, so supporting employees in that benefit, those benefit payments. And you can also consider creative programs such as new business support advising. So for example, Nokia, when they were going through financial hardship in 2011, they allowed employees to apply for a grant whereby they put together a business case, a plan for the business that they wanted to launch, which we know that a lot of successful businesses have emerged from recession. So it might be a good time for employees to think about if they have those personal and professional goals. But essentially they could apply for a grant from Nokia, and if approved, they would get some small funding, but also they would have access to networking, advisory services for a defined period of time. Now, Nokia took no stake in those businesses. You probably want to work with legal counsel to make sure you've got appropriate risk management in place, but that's a great way to support employees, but also be reducing costs for your organization, long-term, I should say. The next method to consider is limiting overtime, which depending on how many employees you have on overtime, this can yield some low to moderate cost savings. So this is where you're requiring employees to get supervisor and maybe even executive level approval before incurring any overtime. You might also want to consider what you're including in overtime. So for example, we know that here in the state of Wisconsin, you're not required to include holiday pay in overtime calculations. If you're an employer that typically has been including holiday pay, then perhaps it's something you want to take out for this time period. Now, you want to make sure that you're setting clear expectations with employees and supervisors in advance. So it'd be a good idea to get their sign off that they understand the policy change. And then also you want to make sure that you're abiding by, state and federal regulations. So again, that legal counsel is important. So for example, if any overtime is incurred, you as an employer are legally responsible. You're required to pay for that overtime, even if that employee did not get your approval in advance. So you want to make sure you're still paying it, but you're closely monitoring those hours to prevent those overtime occurrences if they're not absolutely necessary. The next method to consider is reducing or shifting healthcare benefit premium percentage from employer to employee, which depending on the significance of the percentage that's shifted, the percentage of employees or the number of employees that you have on your benefits, it can yield moderate to low cost savings. So this is requiring employees to pay essentially a larger portion of those healthcare premiums. We suggest that you consult with your benefits broker and advisor before employing this method. And of course, remember that employees went through open enrollment and made their selections based on theirs and their family's needs and budgets. So you want to consider the impact of coverage sustainability for those employees. And also ensure that adjusted premiums do not exceed 9.78% of employees' household income. Another method to consider is suspending base pay increases, which can yield moderate to low savings. So this is freezing or reducing the dollars allocated for base pay increases for the year or maybe longer than that. So this might include merit increases, cost of living adjustments or COLAs, promotion increases, things like that. Now, when we surveyed employers in our COVID-19 employer survey on the prevalence of this, we found that about 19% of employers are delaying merit or COLA pay increases between at least 6 to 12 months, but some might be effective for more than 1 year. Of course, this could impact compensation competitiveness over the long term, but it's balancing that need for short-term survival during this difficult time. The next method to consider is suspending mileage, cell phone, and meal expense reimbursement, which can yield some low cost savings depending on the significance of these expenses within your organization. So you're temporarily suspending reimbursing employees for work-related mileage, cell phone usage, or meals. And you might also include other allowances if you have them, such as maybe a car allowance, housing, things along those lines. Now, you want to make sure, similar to some of the other things we were discussing, that you're setting clear and early expectations with employees. You don't want them incurring those expenses and then being blindsided thinking that they were going to be reimbursed when you've made the determination not to reimburse them. And here's another great reason to seek financial legal counsel, because some states do require employers to reimburse mileage and other business-related expenses. So you just want to see, what options you have in this regard. The next method to consider is suspending non-essential subscriptions and memberships, which can yield low cost savings depending on how many of these types of programs you have for employees. So you're temporarily suspending subscriptions and or memberships to magazines, professional associations. I know some who've suspended country club or golf course memberships. Now that might be changing as things reopen here, but as the need to conduct business in that fashion or through these methods has paused or slowed down, many are putting these types of non-essential expenses on hold for employees. Of course, you want to consider the impact on talent development and the ability to perform work. So if there's a lot of development work that's occurring for the organization through some type of membership, it may be something you want to deem as essential. Also, employees may miss out on important information related to their role and profession. So it's just going to be a balancing act, and one that you're probably going to want to determine on a case-by-case basis. The next method to consider is removing pay premiums. So this is temporarily suspending special pay programs like shift, on-call, callback, language differentials, etc. Of course, you want to monitor employment agreements. If you have any obligations to make these payments, it's likely not going to be something that you can consider at this time. Additionally, we know that some states and municipalities have strict requirements around pay premiums, such as on-call, callback pay, 6th or 7th day pay. There's a lot of things to consider. So you want to be sure that you're seeking that legal counsel before removing these types of programs. And it may have, you may choose to have varying policies if you're a multi-state employer, so that you're just abiding by the minimum requirements within each location. But of course, consider the internal equity impact, potential disruption amongst employees if they find out that there's some difference in treatment there. So to tie these employment cost containment methods together, I wanted to share with you an example from Nokia, again back to 2011, where they incorporated many different methods as they gave employees, choices or paths from which to choose during that time. So for example, employees had the choice of finding another job at Nokia. They had to go through a selection committee that was not based on managers. It was a cross-functional committee of the organization in order to mitigate the risk of favoritism. They also gave them the option to find another job outside of Nokia. And so they supported them in outplacement services, networking, things like that to help them land on their feet more quickly. Start a new business. That was something we talked about earlier. So applying for a grant to fund a new business idea. And again, Nokia took no stake in that venture. Learn something new. So this was allowing employees to apply for a professional development grant that they could use to fund training or education to go down perhaps a new career path. And it may not have been anything to do with Nokia's career opportunities. So for example, it might have been somebody applying for a grant to pursue a career in nursing. And lastly, build a new path. So this was supporting employees who may have chosen to apply for a grant to support personal goals. So perhaps they wanted to do volunteering during this time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some non-employment cost containment methods. If at all possible, oftentimes these methods are the first ones we want to deploy just to limit the impact that we have on employment costs containment, as we know that those can be some challenging decisions as well. So to briefly go through these, some methods that you can consider are reducing online sponsored posts or advertisements. Right now, we know that many organizations are not able to invest in unnecessary expenditures right now. So it might be a good time to hit the pause button on some of those online ads you might be investing in. You can also think about adjusting or shortening business hours to save on operating expenses. Of course, you want to communicate in advance with customers, suppliers, employees, so that you have appropriate expectations set. You can cancel unnecessary third-party services or bring in-house. For example, at QTI, we've got a mail pickup service, office supply servicing, and right now, with the majority of our workforce remote, we've had less demand for these services. So they've been things that we've been able to put on pause. You can also evaluate what investments might be put on hold. So for example, if you're planning to invest in a new technology this year, if you can hold off until next year, that might be something to consider. Next, you can review vendor contracts to see what can be reduced or canceled. I've been really pleased with some of the vendors that we work with here at QTI. They've been extremely, I can think of at least 3 that have been extremely accommodating and just reducing unnecessary expenditures during this time. You can centralize operations if you have multiple brick and mortar locations. So perhaps instead of operating 3 stores, it's directing people to just 2. You can request temporary rent reduction from landlords. I know of many employers who've been able to use this tactic, so it's definitely something to consider. Extending payment terms with suppliers. Many are understanding and gracious during this time, so feel free to reach out to them to ask for a payment extension if you need to. And then reducing inventory. If you have inventory on hand and there's anything that you can sell to free up cash flows, definitely something to explore. Now, as we close here, I wanted to share some parting comments with you. First of all, we encourage you to engage employees in cost-saving ideas. Oftentimes, employees are closest to the front lines and they've got great perspective on what is or is not an essential business expense. Also, engaging employees gives you the opportunity to give them greater purpose, which for many during this difficult time, there can be a struggle with a feeling of helplessness. So engaging them in this cost-saving ideation process can not only yield greater results long-term for your organization through better solutions, but it can also increase employee engagement through greater purpose. And lastly, I'd say that on this point, if you are needing to roll out these strategies, having included employees in that process, you're likely going to have gained allies who will be able to support you as you roll out those changes. The second comment I'd make is to make sure that you're communicating clearly, openly, authentically, and regularly. The river that we are going down right now is moving so swiftly, and it's got a lot of tight curves. We can only see so far around the bend, and it's really important, therefore, that we are keeping employees regularly informed. A best practice is to have a source of truth document, weekly company calls or meetings, so that you're keeping them in the loop on how strategies are adapting, what organization goals are, so that they can stay focused, so that you're managing that rumor mill. You don't want employees assuming worst case scenario unnecessarily. And so you want to make sure you're keeping them focused, productive, and engaged. Next, it's important to maintain a sense of calm. Employees are going to embody the way that you lead. If you are leading with panic, they're going to embody that panic. And so it really starts with good leadership. And in Brene Brown's book, Brene Brown is one of my favorite authors, by the way. She's got a wonderful book called Dare to Lead. And in that book, she talks about this concept of oversharing. So it's really important to communicate, but it's also you want to be careful that you're not oversharing, or that you're framing the messages that you're sharing in a constructive way, so that you're not creating a sense of panic amongst employees. So for example, rather than tell employees, I'm extremely worried about the organization, I think we're going to go under, perhaps instead frame it as, hey everyone, we need to realize $100,000 in savings in the next month. Here are some methods that I've identified. What ideas do you have? And in engaging employees in that honest discussion, you're likely going to find that employees are more amenable to self-sacrifice, such as pay reductions and things like that, to help the greater good of the organization. Now, you want to make data-driven decisions. There's a lot of emotion going on right now, and as such, it's just natural that we might be responding in that emotion, that anxiety. And so we strongly encourage you to keep an eye on those KPIs, use that data to drive decisions, and also be careful in the statements that you're sharing with employees. You don't want to make blanket statements such as, we put employees first, if in reality you have to be, the goal might be to save as many jobs as possible while honoring bank covenants. So for all those reasons, really important to be careful about what you're communicating. And then lastly, we've shared a lot of tips today, and as you can tell, as we were going through, there's a lot of complexities. And so you want to make sure you're mitigating your risk here, and that you are seeking counsel with appropriate experts, be it HR, legal, financial. So engage those experts to mitigate your risk. In closing here, we've got some additional resources for you to consider. I invite you to check out QTI's COVID-19 webpage. as it's going to have great information for you on white papers that we've done, findings from our surveys, things along those lines, as well as links to recordings from other webinars. So definitely something to check out. We've got links here to some of the stimulus bills, such as FFCRA, the CARES Act, also Wisconsin Safer at Home Order, CDC website. Directing you towards the bottom here of the page, we've got a link to U.S. Department of Labor. There's an excellent FAQs page regarding furloughs and other reduction in pay and hours worked issues. So strongly encourage you to check that out. We've got a link to Q&A for the FFCRA as well. Workshare, that's that program I mentioned earlier. I invite you to check out this website for additional insights, as it's going to help businesses to avoid layoffs and thereby help both the employer and employees. Some of the research we talked about was from Harvard Business Review today, and so we invite you to check out their thought pieces in that regard, specific to layoffs in response to COVID-19. So, in closing, as we go through this downturn, it's going to be tough to make these difficult decisions to keep our organizations afloat. But those who lead with compassion and heart, they're going to emerge from this stronger than ever before. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions that you have. Again, if you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that, type in your question, and it'll go to our moderator, Jill. And I will help with those questions, but more importantly, I have a fantastic colleague by the name of Sharon Egan. And Sharon is our Director of HR Client Relations here at QTI. Sharon and her team of HRBPs, they are supporting about 150 companies with about 2,500 employee lives. So they're helping them in our outsourced HR division on the front lines, address many of these challenges of how to get through this difficult time. So Sharon, thank you so much for being here today. I'd like to open things up to questions. So it seems like the first question we have here from respondents is in regards to where we can find the recording and deck afterwards. We encourage you to go to the QTI COVID-19 resources page. We are going to have a link to the recording and the slides, as well as a white paper related to this topic posted there. But we're also going to send you an email afterwards with a link to the recording and slides as well, just to make that easier for you. But as things are constantly changing, we're putting more and more resources up there, so definitely something to check out. The next question we have here is, if you do need to move to layoffs, how open should you be with employees about other cost-saving methods? Sorry, let me just catch this one here. If you do need to move to layoffs, how open should you be with employees about other cost-saving methods you may have tried? It's a great question. Sharon, would you mind providing your response to that question?
Thank you, Summer, and thank you everybody for participating in today's webinar. So if you think back to some of the commentary that Summer's already shared with you, lead with heart and compassion, use transparent communication, I think it is in your best interest to talk about the cost-saving measures that you've implemented, those that you've considered and have not implemented, and why you made that business decision. And then explain that the layoff is an option that you now are in a position to have to consider or implement if you've already made that decision. Back in 2008, during the economic downturn, I was working for a large Wisconsin employer that was heavily impacted by that situation. And we were faced with a number of reduction in workforce decisions. One of them that we considered was having a transparent conversation with employees. We actually had employees raise their hands saying, look, I'm considering retiring early. I would do that. Is there an opportunity that if I volunteer to exit, I could be saving some positions for my colleagues? So we were, pleasantly surprised that having open dialogue resulted in an easier transition for people because there were people already choosing to exit. And so those decisions felt less painful because we knew that we weren't necessarily adversely impacting people's families because they were going to take that path anyway. So I would encourage you to be transparent to the extent that you can and have conversations about why you need to make certain decisions. And if you know that it's temporary, to then communicate that as well so people don't feel as though this is the end of the road, that it's a temporary situation. And as soon as business prospects change, you're intending to call them back.
A great response, Sharon. And just to expand on your last comment, I've had the pleasure of listening to you field questions from this webinar for others. And one thing that I've appreciated that you've shared in those other webinars is the need to not set any false expectations. So don't, identify that it's any specific dates if they're not going to be dates that you can stick to. So make sure that you're letting employees know, what is a reasonable time frame. Perhaps if you can set certain performance hurdles that need to be achieved. I think that's a great way to provide more perspective on when things may shift back. If you are able to perhaps bring people off of furlough or restore pay reductions, things along those lines, being clear about those performance hurdles is a good way to, give employees something to strive for. The next question that we have here is, if you do a base pay reduction, does it have to be the same percentage across all employees, or can you vary it by work units? Sharon, would you mind providing first response to this?
So the simple answer is yes. You can have varying pay changes across your business. What you want to make sure is that you have a business rationale for doing that. So if, for instance, maybe your sales force travels, and obviously during this period of time, they aren't traveling, and therefore their business unit really just doesn't have work to perform. And other business units maybe they're in your call center. And so the volume of business in your call center is highly increased because that's the only method that clients have to communicate with you. So if you're reducing pay for your sales force, but not reducing pay for your call center, that certainly makes business sense. You could do it based on, I'm sure you've heard in the news yesterday that a Unity Point Meritor and UW Medical have done some salary reductions, and they've disclosed to the public that executives took a larger pay cut than certain other levels within the organization, and that they did not reduce pay cuts for hourly employees. So that would be a different type of an example of how you might administer a pay adjustment on a temporary basis.
Thank you, Sharon. And, QTI's employer survey in regards to COVID-19 did find that there are 17% of employers that indicated that they have resorted to base pay reductions, and the majority of those did not vary the percentage or reduction. across employees, they did have a consistent percentage, with that median reduction being about 15%, but definitely something that needs to be considered, unique to each organization's needs. We've got time for another question here. This one is from Mary Madison. Do you think there will be lawsuits if people start to travel again and become infected with COVID-19? Is there a way to help reduce this chance? Maybe this is something to ask our insurance agent. Sharon, do you have some perspective on this question?
Oh, that's a new one. I haven't had this question. Well, first of all, I think in your communication with employees, you still have, the responsibility to have a safe workplace. So to communicate without requiring that you would ask employees to limit travel, to continue to honor social distancing. Certainly you can dictate, if it's business travel, whether or not you're going to allow people to travel for business. So to that degree, that's in your control. Personal travel obviously isn't. But you can make the request, you can suggest, you can share CDC information, you can share World Health Organization information as part of your regular and ongoing communication with employees about best practices and safe workplace. You do have the right to tell people that if they have traveled, that you're going to follow the CDC recommendations that they self-quarantine for 14 days before returning to the workplace. So you have those options available to you. With regard to lawsuits, I guess time will only tell. I am not a soothsayer about that. And we live in a world that tends to be somewhat litigious. And your point about checking with your insurance agent or your legal counsel would probably be my advice.
Great response, Sharon. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This last question is, how often should we be communicating with those on furlough? We have no idea when they will be coming back, but feel like we should still be keeping in touch with them. Sharon, would you mind sharing your expertise in regards to this question? It's an excellent one.
It is an excellent one, and I think you've sort of resonated your own response when you said we feel like we should be keeping in touch with them. It sounds like your culture is one of connectedness and engagement, and so I would encourage you to honor that kind of culture. One of the things that you want to do is to make sure that your furloughed employees still feel connected to the organization. So however you are doing that, clearly you want to keep all of your employees engaged with your organization, keep them up to date on what is happening within your company, sharing information about other cost containment activities that you have implemented. Certainly allowing people to connect just on a personal level, because people that are on furlough, they feel even more isolated from their colleagues than just being a remote worker would. So, finding ways to communicate business information that's relevant. It may not be related to when they may be called back, but it certainly still is, what's happening within the organization, how is business progressing, what are some of the new decisions that have been made, and certainly connecting people as people, because it is your business family. So The frequency really is based on, in part, your culture and in part what information you would have to share.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. And I know of some that are doing this on a weekly basis, and it's helpful, you know, for all when we can support employees in those moments that matter, especially if they do ultimately need to exit the organization. You don't know if they might return someday as clients, or perhaps a boomerang employee someday, or refer others. So for many reasons, it's really important to just make sure that you're demonstrating care for employees in those moments that matter. Well, I'd like to extend an invitation for you to reach out to me afterwards if you have any additional questions. Thank you so much to all of you for attending. Thank you for DMI for inviting us. Thank you for Sharon for your excellent perspective. We wish you all the very best as you go through this difficult time. Take care, everyone. Thank you.